Good afternoon, and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday afternoon series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis. Today, we are fortunate to be hosting a Praxis favorite, Richard Heinberg. Usually, we talk about environmental issues and the climate crisis with Richard, but today we're going to be talking about the really big picture based on his recent paper, The Great Unraveling, Navigating the Polycrisis of Environmental and Social Breakdown. Doesn't that sound uplifting? And you can actually get a copy of this paper, which I'm recommending to everybody, by going to the postcarbon.org website. It is available for free, and I think it's really worth your time, not just to read, but to study. Richard Heinberg is a senior fellow at the Post Carbon Institute in Santa Rosa. He is the author of 13 books, including Our Renewable Future, Laying the Path for 100% Clean Energy, Afterburn, Snake Oil, The End of Growth, Power, and many others. He is regarded as one of the world's foremost advocates for a shift away from our current reliance on fossil fuels. He has delivered hundreds of lectures on energy and climate issues in 14 countries and has addressed policymakers from city councils to members of the European Parliament. He has written for many publications, including Nature, Reuters, the Associated Press, Time, and Yes Magazine, among others. He has also appeared in many TV and film documentaries, including Leonardo DiCaprio's 11th Hour. So welcome, Richard. It's great to have you back with us today.
Thank you, Georgia.
And before I ask the first question, I just wanted to tell you and everybody that after reading and actually studying this paper, I came away from it neither an optimist nor a pessimist, neither hopeful nor hopeless, but I felt empowered. And that's something that surprised me because I didn't expect to feel that, but I did because of the way you go into what we're up against, fully explaining it, the interconnectedness, and what we can do about it. You know, what are some of the things we can do to hopefully change some of what could be coming down the pipeline, and also how we cope with what is actually happening and will happen. And I found it empowering. So that's why I'm highly recommending it to people. And the first question I wanted to ask you is the obvious, I guess. I'd like you, briefly to describe what the Great Unraveling is. You describe it as a momentous turning point, similar to the discovery of language. That is huge, a startling statement, in fact. So I'd like you to elaborate on that a little bit and what the crises are we're needing to navigate.
Well, okay.
Too much?
No.
Choose what you want to answer out of that.
Yeah. Well, see, we human beings have been on a general trajectory for a long time, accumulating more and more power, more ability to affect one another and our environment in various ways, going all the way back to the Stone Age, tools, language, then social power with money, metal tools, communication technologies, all the way up to empires, and then the beginning of the fossil fuel revolution, industrial revolution, a couple of hundred years ago. And then all hell breaks loose, and suddenly we in just 200 years we gain immense power over the environment, so that we're instead of cutting down trees with axes, we're using giant chainsaws and cutting hundreds at a time instead of one at a time. And the same thing with fish and mining ores from the Earth's crust and so on. And social power is increasing at the same time. We're increasing our population from 1 billion to 8 billion today. So the scale of social organization is increasing. Instead of cities of a few tens of thousands, maybe, which would be a really big deal in the 18th century, now we have cities of tens of millions. And it's all organized by means of instantaneous communication, modulated by computers and all the rest. Okay, so we've been on this trajectory, right? And we're hitting the limits to what is possible for human beings to do without wrecking the biophysical basis for our ability to do anything whatsoever. We have accumulated all this power, and power is a good thing. Without power, we can't do anything. It's the ability to do, power is the ability to do something. So, hey, we want to be able to do things, but it's possible to have too much of a good thing. And fossil fuels really propelled us faster than anything. We were already on this trajectory with, the European conquests of the rest of the world by means of, sailing ships and metal weapons and guns and so on. But with fossil fuels, we've taken it so far, so fast that now we're facing what is being called a polycrisis, which is not just climate change as a result of burning fossil fuels, but the disappearance of wild nature, the proliferation of toxic chemicals throughout the environment that are altering reproduction in not just humans, but in other species as well. Insects disappearing. The biomass of insects on planet Earth is declining, according to the latest estimate, by about 2% per year. The oceans are also, ocean ecosystems are also under threat. And then we're also facing social consequences of too much, too fast, in the form of increasing economic inequality, which is not just unfair, certainly is that, but it's also dangerous to social systems of all kinds. There's a great deal, and I'd be happy to talk about this more later, of social research evidence based on study of historical patterns and current patterns around the world to suggest that as economic inequality increases, it destabilizes government, it increases political polarization, and so on. So we're facing this whole package of crises, this polycrisis, all at once. And it's really hard for us to focus on even one thing, which is, say, climate change, when all of the rest are nipping at our heels at the same time. And even if we succeed in doing something about climate change, there's all the rest of these things, that the toxics crisis, which I wrote about in a longer piece recently, by itself could result in a near universal sterility by about 2060 if current trends continue, declining male sperm counts, not just in humans, but in higher animals across the board. So, we've reached the end of the road in terms of a certain direction of social evolution. And that's hard to really grasp for us, because this is what we know. This is the world into which we've been born, the world of consumerism, of jet airplanes and cars and shopping malls and TV advertising and all this. We take it for granted. This is how people live. This is how people should live. And of course, our first response to something like climate change is to try to figure out how to basically keep doing exactly what we're doing, but with a different energy source. We'll switch out fossil fuels for solar panels and just keep doing everything. We'll fly electric airplanes somehow. In case you're wondering, electric airplanes don't work very well, but somehow we'll be able to do everything we're doing now. We won't have to sacrifice anything, because no politician can stand up in front of his or her constituents and say, well, we have to give up stuff in order to solve these problems. No. Can't do that. So therefore, no one's actually proposing real solutions. We are coming, as I say, we're coming to the end of this road. Now, what does that mean? What does it look like? What do we do given this? That's really what the paper is about.
That went right to my next question. actually. I have
Yeah.
10, which I won't get to all of them. I'll just choose depending on how you answer the ones I ask. But the next one I wanted to ask you about is how Americans, and actually people all over the world, but since we're here, let's focus on our country, how we navigate problems. Like during World War II, as you mentioned in your paper, there were shortages of everything and people rallied around it. People were okay with rationing meat and food and dairy products and eggs and gasoline and luxury items. People had rationing stamps, and they could only get so many things per month. And that seemed to work really well. Trying to sell the public on this today seems monumental.
Mhm.
And especially in our polarized climate. But it just seems like people are much more selfish than they were then. And so I want to ask you, do you think it's possible to get some sort of a rationing campaign going, whether it might just be voluntary to begin with? That's part of the question. And the other part is, I think one of the reasons why it might have been successful is FDR had those fireside chats, and he did maybe 4 of them a year. And they weren't State of the Union addresses. They were fireside chats. They were informal. People were listening on their radios. There were no TVs then. And I read a statistic that really surprised me. Between 59 and 70% of radio audiences tuned in to hear FDR and his fireside chats. That means he was really reaching most of the country. I mean, it's extraordinary. I can't imagine a president reaching that amount of people today. So I'd like you to also comment, do you think there's anyone who could initiate chats like that at the level of at least a senator? And how that might work with the public, and if it's possible to get to rationing from some kind of a program like that?
Well, to answer the second part of your question first, I don't think there's anyone out there who's capable of doing that right now. I mean, if Taylor Swift knew all this stuff and were able to communicate about it, maybe she could, but I don't,
Let's educate her.
Yeah, she's too busy writing songs and doing all that stuff too. We are too polarized, and that's part of the problem. And of course, it's the result of what I was talking about earlier, increasing economic inequality, which breeds lack of trust. Now, yeah, we had rationing during World War II, and rationing, I think, is the best way forward in terms of if we're going to make it through this tightening of consumption and population and, moving away from consumerism to something where we're actually living within the boundaries of Earth's ecosystems. Once again, it's going to be a process to get there, but if it's going to be a peaceful process and a process with minimal casualties, then rationing is absolutely essential. And there's some good proposals out there like tradable energy quotas, which is a British idea, which is basically a form of energy rationing. The reason it worked in World War II is we had much more social solidarity, much less polarization. That's partly a result of, it was right after the Great Depression. And one of the effects of the Great Depression was that it destroyed an immense amount of wealth at the top of the economic pyramid. Remember all the investors jumping off the buildings because they'd lost all their money when Wall Street crashed and so on. So yeah, people at the bottom of the economic pyramid were really suffering, but the amount of wealth disparity in the country actually contracted pretty significantly during the Great Depression. And FDR came along he was the right guy at the right time to be able to pull people together. There was, of course, still political polarization. There were people who tried to assassinate FDR. Yeah. But he was able to overcome that and pull the country together. And then World War II comes along and people are willing to sacrifice. Now we have an enemy much bigger actually right now than Nazi Germany or fascist Japan. It's hard to imagine that, but it's real, and it's climate change, it's toxics in the environment. It's the disappearance of wild nature. It's all those things I was talking about earlier. Nazi Germany would have been terrible if it had taken over the world. But what we're talking about is the possibility of human extinction, which is that really is worse.
That really is worse.
So it's a bigger problem, and yet we can't bring ourselves together to face it. You got, the new Speaker of the House is a climate denier. So how are we supposed to do anything if we're so divided? So yeah, we need to ration, but I think it's unlikely right now, at least in this country. It doesn't look exactly the same in every country around the world. I think there are other countries where rationing can work. And in fact, there's discussion about degrowth in a number of countries around the world, including a number of European countries. Not so much here. I'm sorry to say the U.S. is not well placed right now to lead the world in the direction we actually need to go.
There's too much individualism, and that's something that really, I think, came about since the Reagan era, primarily.
Yeah.
A couple of areas that I'd like to touch on right now. One of them is the myths that we have been educated to believe in. The myth of progress that you mentioned in your paper, the constant economic growth, or that technology will fix the problems, and that we are exceptional. We'll figure out the way no matter how bad it is. And this is a mythology that is so strong in our country that I think it dovetails on what you were just saying. But how do we bust through these myths and debunk them to the point where we can actually get something done?
It requires a process, I think, of self-deprogramming. And I wrote a paper recently about cultic thinking, and in it I shared the fact that my wife and I actually met 40 years ago when we were both part of a religious cult. And so I have a number of years of experience living in a cultic environment, seeing the dynamics of it, the patriarchal leadership, the groupthink, the subtle ways of dissuading people from having independent thoughts for themselves and keeping everybody, on the same page. And once we left the cult, we spent several years deprogramming ourselves by reading books on critical thinking and on world religions and atheism and all different perspectives, so that we could, develop our ability to think for ourselves. And during that process, it became clear how much cultic thinking there is all over the place. As Americans, as modern industrial people, we're indoctrinated into a set of beliefs that virtually no one questions. And the reason these beliefs have taken hold is because they solved problems. They work at a certain level. So even if you can show that they're irrational and that they're leading us toward a terrible future, it's really hard for people to let them go. Just one example, and it's one that I use frequently. I hope I haven't already used this in one of our previous talks. I probably have, but I'll do it again. Consumerism. A lot of us who are think of ourselves as environmentalists agree that consumerism is a really bad thing. Consumerism is a really bad thing. The belief that, oops, we're getting an echo here. Okay, went off. The belief that everybody should consume as much stuff as they can, as they want. Okay, well, where did that come from? It came about in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s as a result of a big problem that existed then, which included the Great Depression, but it was a problem of overproduction and unemployment. And so smart people got together, people in government and industry, and said, well, we have to encourage more consumption so as to create more jobs, more returns on investment so that we can reinvest more capital, get the engine of the economy going, and put people back to work. This was really needed back then. And so it became part of the mythos, and government and industry collaborated in these messages about, the American way, which is industry, consumption, advertising, consumer credit, all of these together as a package, making it possible for you to have a job. Okay, what's not to like? Well, it's only when you step back and see that as an integrated system that's leading to the plundering of Earth's ecosystems and sending us out on an ecological limb that is about to break, that you realize that this is actually kind of a cultic system in which we're constantly indoctrinated by advertising and the press, which of course, if you're the New York Times, you have to have advertising. That's what pays the bills. So you subtly absorb the perspective of the people who are buying your advertising time, or if you're a TV network or whatever. And it's all like a hermetically sealed opinion bubble that we all live in, and to think outside it is very, very difficult. I mentioned earlier, for a politician to say, well, we need to degrow the economy. This is, we're getting to a point of, this is getting dangerous. We're growing the economy to such an extent that we're using so much materials and energy that future generations will suffer as a result. So we have to do this. It's going to be difficult, but we'll share the burden and so on. Impossible. Any politician who stood up and said that would just be booed off the stage instantly, because that's outside of this thought bubble that we're all in. Okay, sorry.
Now, this is really interesting, and I wanted you to, where can we find a copy of that paper on the cultish behavior that you wrote? That was an excellent paper. Where can we get that?
Oh, it's, if you just Google Heinberg, let's see, what was the title of it?
I don't remember, but I was really impressed with that.
I think it was cultic. Yeah, cultic thinking, something about cultic thinking. So if you Google Heinberg cultic, it'll take you right to the paper.
John, would you put that in the chat box? It's really important. There are two things I want to get to before I open it up to the audience. And one is, you mentioned, and I think this is really important for everyone on the call to understand, that 85% of global energy right now comes from fossil fuels. So that a transition seems truly almost impossible. And to try and transition 85% of our energy source to some other types of sources, how would that happen? Or how do you see that happening? Let's hear the best scenario first. I know you mentioned manufacturing and transportation would have to really be slashed. So how do you see dealing with that?
Right. Well, this is another whole talk, but the difficulty is, it's going to take me, I'm sorry, it's going to take me a few minutes to explain this. It's not just that, 85% of our energy currently comes from fossil fuels. You'd think, well, we can just chip away at that bit by bit. And a lot of people think we're much further along than we actually are, because when they talk about energy, they're only really talking about electrical power. And, you read about this company or that city or someplace is getting, most of its energy from renewables now. Well, what they're actually saying is they're getting most of their electrical power from renewables. Electricity is 20% of total energy. So it's that other 80% that's going to be difficult. So what do? We have to electrify lots of things. Of course, that's the whole rationale for electric cars. But some things are going to be much more difficult to electrify than others. Cars are actually low-hanging fruit. My wife and I just got our second electric car. We had a Nissan Leaf. We bought a Chevy Bolt. Great car. I like electric cars. But, electric 18-wheel trucks, electric ships for shipping stuff across the oceans, electric aircraft, much, much more difficult. And then you get into manufacturing stuff, starting with steel and concrete. Well, how do we make cement in cement kilns that run at 1,500 degrees centigrade, 24/7, 365 days a year? You could run a cement kiln with electricity, but it would be way more expensive. So how do you deal with that? Well, you make synthetic fuels. You start with hydrogen. You combine the hydrogen with CO2 from the atmosphere. You can make any kind of synthetic fuel, like ammonia, for example. Some people are saying could be a good fuel. Some people say, well, just use the hydrogen directly, but there's some problems with that because hydrogen's tiny molecule, tends to leak through everything. The average hydrogen storage container leaks 5% of the hydrogen every day. So that's, if you're going to use it right away, that's okay. But so, you start running into these difficult problems. I worked for a year with David Fridley, who's on the energy analysis team at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. We worked for a year together trying to map out what the opportunities and the problems were. And what we came up with is that, you can do anything that needs to be done in the energy transition. You can do it all on the tabletop. At a small scale. You can make the synthetic fuels. You can make road building materials without oil. You could, you come up with a problem, and it's possible to do on a very small scale. But doing it at the massive industrial scale that we're operating today globally, in many cases, we found it very difficult to imagine realistic transition strategies. So what's actually going to happen is we're going to hit the low-hanging fruit over the course of the next 20 years. We'll build a lot of electric cars and a lot of solar panels and a lot of wind turbines. But most of the fossil fueled infrastructure is going to remain in place just because, we're relying on somehow the market to drive this thing. Government, in some places will play a bigger role than in others, but a lot of this stuff is just inherently difficult. Scale is the biggest problem. And then there's also this other side of it, which nobody's talking about, which is building all this stuff, not just solar panels, wind turbines, electric cars, new manufacturing equipment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, basically replacing most of the machinery that currently exists in industrial societies. Doing that in 20 years or so is going to require an immense amount of energy. Where's that energy going to come from? In the early stages, it will almost all come from fossil fuels. 85% of our current energy, and as you say, is from fossil fuels. So that means in trying to solve climate change, if we try to do it without reducing the amount of energy that we're using, if we try to just keep doing everything we're doing now with shipping and consumerism and Amazon and everything else, the result will be a big pulse of carbon emissions, which is exactly the thing we're trying to avoid. Now, of course, yes, later on, after we have all the new infrastructure in place, then carbon emissions would decline. But we're talking, later this century sometime, 2060, 2070. Meanwhile, we're just making the problem worse. So the only solution to the energy transition that makes sense, really, is to use less energy. And there we get back to the rationing discussion that we had just a few minutes ago. We have to cooperatively reduce our energy usage without everything falling apart. Yeah. And that's the problem.
Thank you for that. Now, the last question I'm going to ask you is, because you talk about weaving a new tapestry as dealing with this problem or these interrelated problems. So what does that tapestry look like? Tell us some of the things we can do to lessen the impact of the Great Unraveling, how we can best cope with it, with what is inevitable, and perhaps change some of the default path that we are already on.
Right. Well, in face of the polycrisis, the Great Unraveling, whatever you want to call it, there are a number of things that we should be doing if we're aware enough to have the opportunity to do these things. One is to start to see the interconnections between these problems. They're not all happening at the same time just because of chance. They're all related, and fossil fuels are one of the nexus points that is causing a lot of different things at the same time. Obviously, climate change, but also, I talked about toxic chemicals earlier. Most of those chemicals are made from, or at least with, fossil fuels, the energy of fossil fuels. So, it's possible to, if we're changing direction, it's possible to solve lots of things at the same time. And there's actually a word for that. It's called multi-solving, and there's a multi-solving institute, if you want to look that up and check out their work. But, just as, fossil fuels create lots of problems all at once, there are things we can do that actually solve lots of problems at once. But those things generally involve a change of direction toward degrowth, toward reconnection with natural systems, toward protecting natural systems, because natural systems are the original multi-solving network. Natural systems give us everything that we have. And in a traditional society, people are aware of that, and they feel a responsibility to maintain nature and not to take too much of this or that at any one time, so that they're not overburdening natural systems. So getting back to more of an indigenous worldview is a path toward multi-solving. And one of the things we're doing at Post Carbon Institute right now is a podcast series called Holding the Fire, where an interview who's a good friend of ours, Dar Jamail, award-winning journalist, is interviewing indigenous leaders from around the world, a different one in each of the podcast series. And these are really touching, heartfelt, and wise presentations or discussions. One of the things that I think we miss in the modern world really is wisdom, because we're so jazzed about people being smart and intelligent and sharp and quick, that who around us actually has wisdom, and how is that valued? It's not really valued that much in indigenous societies. Those kinds of people were the people you valued the most and you listened to. So protecting people and nature is going to be absolutely key to getting through the polycrisis, the Great Unraveling, and doing so in a way that solves lots of problems at once.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up. And one thing that you reminded me of, and this paper reminded me of, is the original meaning of the word chaos, which was not disorder. From the Greek, it meant boundless empty space and pregnant with possibility. And a Sanskrit definition was the great becoming. And when you look at chaos in that meaning, you see possibility. And I think, in your paper and what you're doing shows possibility as well as what we're up against. And that's the kind of chaos we want. Mm-hmm. So now I'm going to open it up for, I see Fran Corton has her hand up. Do you want to unmute,
great.
Fran?
Yeah, so I take your point that if we're really going to solve the energy crisis, we need to reduce our use of energy. So I would like to hear from you, Richard, some examples where you see somehow there being a reduction in the use of energy and how we can amplify that path. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Fran. Obviously, to do this in a coordinated way will require the participation of government, industry, and ordinary citizens. It will require communications, and what we think of as advertising, changing a mindset, because so far the only instances where we've reduced energy usage and therefore carbon emissions, the biggest instances were the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID pandemic. If you look at the graph of global energy usage, you see two big notches where those two things happened. And otherwise, we're just marching up, 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 up. So,
right. But are there small scale examples that you feel, help us see the possibilities?
Right. Well, anywhere in the world where you find people, riding bicycles rather than driving cars, wherever you see functional public transit systems, that's one example of how to do a lot with less energy. People living in smaller houses, in more functional social networks. So people are relying more on one another, on people power, rather than just, paying money for services from further away and from people they don't know, which, those kinds of transactions typically end up costing more energy as well as money. So that's the general direction we need to go. And all you have to do is go to, a less industrialized culture, and you can see people using less energy on a daily basis everywhere around you. It's hard for us to imagine in the US, because everybody would say, oh, you mean living like people in a third world country? And immediately everyone tunes out. But you actually go to a poorer country, and you see people living their lives, often happier than people in the US, and they're using much less energy. In many cases, a fifth or less of the energy that we use. People in Europe use about half the energy per capita as North Americans, right? So are people in Europe starving in the dark? No, they live perfectly good lives. But, realistically, we in the US would probably need to aim for considerably less than half of our current energy usage. That's a big challenge. And
You're right. We need Taylor Swift to push it.
Yeah, right.
I'm going to go to Jerry next.
Yeah, thanks, Georgia. I've got two questions. The first is, are you familiar with Aviva Chomsky's book, Is Science Enough? And what do you think of it? And the second is that my sense is that Mark Jacobson has been one of the major promoters of false techno-optimism, and one of the people who's made it most difficult to think in terms of degrowth. What's your sense of that, and how might we deal with someone like Jacobson, who just kind of overwhelms people with his hyper technical expertise? So those are my two questions.
Yeah. I haven't read Aviva Chomsky's book. I've written down the title, and I'll look into it. Thanks for the recommendation.
I think it's an excellent book.
It's fabulous.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I can't comment on it until I have read it. Mark Jacobson's work I'm very familiar with, and he's been very influential. I mean, you look at what's arguably our most prominent climate organization in this country. It's 350.org. And unfortunately, their leaders have bought into Jacobson's ideas lock, stock, and barrel. I'm frustrated by that, because I share your concerns with the accuracy of with the factual accuracy of his proposals of what's possible, and with the techno-optimistic tone that he puts out. But let's face it, if Mark Jacobson didn't exist, somebody would invent him, because what he's saying is exactly what a lot of people want to hear. They want to hear that, climate change is a huge problem, but we have all the technology that we need to fix it in a way that we don't actually have to sacrifice anything. Now, maybe we'll have to drive an electric car instead of gasoline car. Maybe we'll have to have some solar panels on our roof. but we'll make the transition and we'll create jobs. Everybody will be better off. And the only thing that's keeping us from doing it is some nasty people in Congress who want to stand in the way, or in the fossil fuel industry, the bad people, the mean people. And if we defeat the mean, bad people, then we can have everything we want. Everything will be fine. Everybody gets their own pet unicorn and lives happily ever after. And it's just not, I'm sorry, it's not true.
Okay, I want to go to Ray next.
Not sure how I follow up on the pet unicorn thing.
At Raccoon.
Yeah, so I put a link in there about the book, The Fourth Turning, and I wanted to get your opinion about it because it sounds like it's very much in line with your concept. More that a direction of how we solve the problem in the transition that is defined there as kind of an 80-year cycle where things fundamentally change, and by all directions we're at that point now. So I wanted to get your take on that, but I see what you're proposing is kind of a call to action about how to make that the best end result. That the turning is happening, but we really need to be kind of at that wave, engineering a good outcome. So that's kind of the nature of what I'd like you to analyze. But I'm also wanting to be sure that, when I think about the kind of sacrifices that you're talking about, I can see, a shift in manufacturing that is more energy efficient, but also designed to be, you make something and it's designed to last, and that we build a culture of repair and kind of more localized efforts. The industry has gone in the opposite direction, planned obsolescence and oh, you can't repair that, that's our proprietary information.
I'm going to cut you off soon.
Yeah.
I see, that there's a way for real people to be, sacrificing, I guess, but by doing more work. So the labor thing needs to increase to kind of offset the manufacturing aspect. So anyway, that's kind of the big picture I'd like you to talk about.
Yeah. There's a lot there. I have read The Fourth Turning, but it's not really fresh in my mind, I have to say. I read it some time ago, and I was struck by the author's view of this sort of historical momentum that brings us to certain kinds of change, cyclical change in society. I'm actually more impressed by the work of some other folks who are doing something somewhat similar, but using a lot more data. And that's Peter Turchin and his colleagues. And they've gathered enormous amounts of data about hundreds of societies, not just the US, but literally hundreds of societies over the last 4,000 or 5,000 years. And they've combed the data for coincidences, cycles, whatever they can glean from it. And one of the things, of course, they found is that all societies tend to expand and then contract. Collapse is an inevitable part of the cycle of societal growth and retreat. But what makes societies collapse, one of the things that they found is increasing economic inequality. Complex societies that have different social classes and so on tend to have what Turchin and his colleagues call a wealth pump that sort of automatically over time causes wealth to rise to the top of the economic pyramid. And so over time, people, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and eventually the poor just don't see any point in continuing to support the whole system, and the thing weakens. And the other thing that happens is, as all the goodies are going to the top, more people want to be part of the elites. So there's an overproduction of elites. In this country, we see it, for example, in law degrees. What's a path to, success? Be a doctor or a lawyer. Well, law degrees, but being a doctor actually requires a lot of hard work. So being a lawyer, though, you could end up in Congress, you could do all. So the number of people with law degrees has absolutely exploded in the last 30, 40 years. Turchin and his colleagues have tracked this. And I'm looking for Turchin's latest book here.
I was just
It's
going to
called
ask you.
End Times.
End Times, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, End Times is his latest book. It's not a cheery read, because it's really looking at the U.S. and the factors that he believes leading the U.S. toward more political violence this decade. We haven't seen the end of it. Yeah.
We only expect cheery things from you, Richard.
Yeah, right. Well, the other thing you asked about was planned obsolescence, and this was part of the strategy of consumerism. I mentioned advertising and consumer credit, but planned obsolescence was part of the strategy as well. So it was a solution to a problem, right? The more stuff breaks down reliably after a short period of usefulness, the more people will have to replace that stuff, which means more manufacturing, which means more manufacturing jobs, right? What's not to like? Well, of course, it's lousy for the earth that has to produce all those raw materials. So, sorry, I have to get this in. When David Fridley and I were looking at, okay, how do you run the world without fossil fuels? We were looking at various sectors. One of those sectors was consumer electronics, which includes cell phones and all computers and all the rest of this stuff. And we had a devil of a time with that. I mean, transportation, okay, you can electrify this, you can make synthetic fuels there. But consumer electronics, boy, you start looking into it, and it's all plastics, it's all, sub-assemblies, it's all major mineral extraction, industrial processes that involve fossil fuels at every step along the way. So the only solution we could come up with is for in the future, everybody gets their cell phone, their smartphone, when they turn 18. And that's it. And then they repair it. They, do whatever they have to do to keep it running. But you don't buy a new one every 2 years. You get it when you're 18, and that's yours, period.
Apple won't like you. Okay, I'm going to go next to Terry. We're not going to get to everybody. I just need to let you know. I see a lot of hands up, but
yeah, the more we hear, the more questions we have. So thank you, George, and thank you, Richard, for being here. I'm always inspired by these kind of talks, and the timelines for like the unraveling and the collapse were similar to what we heard the other night from Jared Diamond. So the question I have for you, though, is more of like, how do you keep pioneering and standing up with your head high when, most of the world, when like I'm an environmentalist, and it's like I used to be the hero, but now in the political realm, environmentalists are somehow like the bad people. Right. When I'm talking to elected officials and to agencies who want to do things that are in complete conflict with what we should really be doing. It's cognitive dissonance all over the place. It's like we're living in apocalypse now, but like I'm sometimes almost afraid to say, shouldn't we be protecting the planet? So how do you, continue on, do your research and be public, and kind of stay sane?
Yeah. Well, I love what I do. I work with really good people. And what I do makes me happy. So I have no problem. Actually, but I don't, what we do is publish stuff, create podcasts, all this. It's all fun, when people who actually have to go talk to elected officials and try to get policies made and so on. I have great admiration for those folks. but that's a different set of skills, and I can see why it would be burnout, a constant burnout. And I've talked to elected officials. As you know, in the introduction said that I talked to all these elected officials. Well, yeah, I've done that, but I don't have to be there in the trenches all the time, seeing these things through. But we try to do what we can to publicize the efforts of people who are protecting nature in various imaginative ways, and indigenous peoples who are simply trying to survive and maintain their perspective and their wisdom.
I'm going to skip around a little bit now because I would like to call on Ned.
Okay, I'll be quick. Thank you. Richard, I really appreciate this presentation. I'm sort of an ecologist and engineer. I've been looking at all the details, but realizing all the time we need a giant cultural transformation to get through this. You've laid out some of the key pieces, so I look forward to reading your work and related things. That's all. Thanks a lot, Richard. This is great.
Well, thank you, Ned. That's great to hear. And just our public website is resilience.org.
Oh,
so
Right.
It doesn't say Post Carbon Institute on it. So sometimes people are surprised when they already know resilience.org, but they don't know that we're putting it out.
Right. Stephanie's next. And then I think we might have to end, but we'll see.
Hi, Richard. It's good to hear you and your knowledge and wisdom. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you,
I have two questions. One is, isn't there a problem of scale when trying to adapt indigenous ways to how we live in, say, this country today? That would be one. The other is, we're always talking about fuel, but aren't there other ways that affect the environment? I'm thinking about agriculture, but part of the problem of agriculture contributing to climate change has to do with fuel. But I don't think that's all of it. Like if we were switching to a regenerative economy, would that be better?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right that indigenous ways of living are tied to smaller scale, and we've created scales of production and distribution that are inherently unsustainable. That's one of the problems of the modern world. So we need to relocalize our economies and relocalize production. Now, of course, once you start thinking that way, then of course the problem comes up. Well, isn't that going to make us more parochial in our thinking and so on? But that's happening anyway. How could we get any more divided than we already are? In fact, when we're working more at the local level, we're dealing with people face to face, and we're dealing with ecosystems that we know, and it's easier to appreciate when those ecosystems are being overtaxed or depleted. And so it makes everything better. Indigenous people are not just somehow inherently smarter or wiser or better people. They're just people who've lived in one place long enough to learn the limits, the ecological limits and rules of those places by trial and error. And it's our misfortune to have created this global society that's not tied to any specific place. And therefore, we believe that there aren't any limits and there aren't any rules. And of course, that's what's going to bite us in the end. So we have to become, global citizens. Okay, maybe there's some good things about that, but we have to become re-indigenized, relocalized. And it's not all about fuel. It's not all about energy. It is the way we produce our food. It's the way we build our houses. It's the way we do really everything that is causing climate change and all these other things. So energy is really important because it's energy that got us into this situation. And it's really important that we understand energy as we try to get ourselves out of it. But it's also water, it's also soil, and it's also our relationship with ecosystems and other species.
I'm looking for what would be an easier way.
An
Stephanie,
easier way. Oh,
I mean,
Yeah.
something that is more doable. Yeah. Than the
Well,
one we picked, which is
yeah.
the fuel energy equation.
Yeah, well, it's
That's what I
the
was
easy
wondering.
way is to start with
Go
where
on
you
first.
are. The easy way is just to start with where you are and
Okay.
what you can do, and then see how things connect. So that if you do this one thing, what's that connected to, and can you solve 5 problems at the same time?
Larry, if you have a quick question, I will take it. It will be the last one, but only if it's a quick question.
Okay, I'm sorry to be the last because it's a fascinating discussion. Thank you, Georgia, for this program. And thank you, Richard, for your work. I just spent a few days with it, and it's very, very helpful. It is the scale that is very needed, but not the scale I work in. I work in the scale of a village with some experience in China and some experience with Latin America. But at this point, I'm looking at the villages of Sonoma Valley, and I'm finding that we have hundreds, literally hundreds of people here at a little town called Glen Ellen that are very hip to all the things you're talking about and are desiring those things and are coming greatly against almost all of the bureaucracy at the county and the state and the economics and the winery system and the educational system. And they're very frustrated and very ticked off. And so there's a very rich opportunity to learn about these polarities and ways of doing things at the scale you're talking about, which is and I'm looking for help from, I would like to get some help from Terry, who I know very well, and from Jerry, who I know, and from Georgia, and from everybody to see what we could do to take one little town, 4,000 people, one census tract, and take your exact model here of the world and put it on that town and just really find out what change people could make in their thinking and their acting and their behaving with each other and with regard to all these things. I have, 3,000 books and a whole lifetime of chasing around these villages. And now I want to do something, just one little village, and then make it work like a virus that other people can say, hey, look at that village. And I want your help.
I think that's exactly the right way to go, and I'm happy to help any way I can. I love Glen Ellen; it's a beautiful community, and one thing I've suggested on many occasions is what we actually need is working models in terms of communities that are reducing their fossil fuel consumption to zero. We don't have any such models, and it's bizarre to me that nobody's thought of doing this. Who's kind of in charge, because they're all. I talked about some of the difficulties, the technical difficulties, the managerial difficulties, the trade-offs, and so on, involved in actually getting to zero fossil fuel infrastructure. Okay, well, how do you solve those problems? Right now, we're just trying to do it in the abstract and piecemeal and so on, without having a working model that you can play with. Where is the community in the US or anywhere around the world that's actually a working model of a community, post-fossil fuel community that's solving these problems? So, hey, there's the opportunity.
Great. Maybe we can look for some of these too. I think our connection is getting a little bit rusty at this point, so it probably is the time to end. But it's been such a fascinating discussion, Richard, and so rich. I mean, just extraordinary. I want to thank you, and I want to follow up with you because I feel like there's a lot more coming out of this, and I want to encourage people to read the paper if you haven't yet. and to also get the one on the cultish behavior, which I think is very important to understand what we're up against right now. So any last things you want to say, Richard, before we finish?
Not really. I mean, it's been a rich discussion. I agree. And I'm always happy to come back, always happy to engage. And you can email me at richard@postcarbon.org, and you can see a archive of my work at richardheinberg.com. So thank
Great.
you.
Thank you so much. We have a recording of this. It will be available tonight. All of you on the call will get it. People who registered and are not on the call will also receive it. And the chat has been saved as well.